After you create your first project in Cubase, the first thing that you'll see is the project window, which is what we're looking at here. Even though we don't have anything recorded in this project, there's a lot to look at. But I'm going to show you how you can use this big project window to your advantage and how to customize it depending on how many monitors you have attached to your computer. But for right now, let's just assume that you're working on a single monitor computer like a laptop computer. So what we're looking at here are 4 individual project window zones as well as 2 individual toolbars. The first toolbar is the main toolbar at the top, and it's where you have your tools and several other buttons that we will be working on throughout this section. The other bar is located at the bottom of the project window, and it is the transport bar. This is where you find things like record, play, markers, and so forth. But for right now, let's concentrate more on the 4 individual zones. If this is the first time you've loaded a Cubase project and you haven't upgraded Cubase from a previous version, chances are you're looking at this 4-zone configuration. There's the left zone, there's the project zone, the lower zone, and the right zone. And each of these zones can be hidden or viewed with the exception of the project zone, which will be seen persistently. But if you look in the toolbar, there are these 3 little buttons that have little icons off to the left, lower, and right ends of the icons. These are the Show Hide Zones button, and right now they're all lit up. So what you can do is by clicking these buttons or their associated keyboard shortcuts, which you can see if you hover your mouse over the button, you'll actually see what the keyboard shortcuts are to make simple work of revealing or hiding those zones. But if we were to click on the left icon here, then the left zone goes away. If we click the next button over, that's the lower zone, and then the next button over is the right zone. So right now we're looking at the project zone only. The project zone is going to have 2 main functions. It's going to be where your tracks are in the track list, as well as the events that you will record onto those tracks, things like sampler tracks or MIDI or instrument tracks or audio tracks. And so in this particular configuration, we can really get into the detail of the events and the tracks themselves because we have so much room on the display by removing those other zones. And what you could do is put those other zones onto a separate monitor. So if you had another monitor connected to your computer or onto your laptop, then you could reveal things like the VST Instruments window. If we go to the Studio menu and call up the Mix Console, then this Mix Console, or the mixer of Cubase, is actually its own separate window, separate from the project window. And so you could put this onto a different monitor. But I'm going to close that for right now because we're going to still pretend that we're on a single monitor or laptop computer. So the problem with this particular view is that we don't have a lot of things to control about the tracks themselves. For example, if we were to add a simple MIDI track and just call it MIDI track 1, then there's some things that we can't program about it, like what MIDI input it's being assigned to or what MIDI output it's assigned to. That is the job of the inspector, and the inspector tab is found in the left zone. So let's come over to our window controllers here and press the left zone button. Now we see our inspector tab, and we can control things like what MIDI input it's recording from, what MIDI output it's going to, and so forth. So that's what the inspector tab does. But by revealing it, it does take up a little bit more screen space on our computer. But I do want to mention that there are multiple tabs on a lot of these different zones. In the left zone, there's the inspector, the visibility controller, and if you look underneath, there's also a track setting as well as a zones setting. So we're not going to deal too much with those right now, but just be aware that you need to look for those individual tabs because they will contain more information and more controls about the settings of different things on the project window. And now that we have our left zone visible and our project zone visible, which we'll always see, we can also turn on the lower zone, and it typically has the Mix Console, which is a smaller version of the full Mix Console, so that you can adjust the levels of your inputs, outputs, and other track volumes, but it also has an editor tab, sampler controller, the chord pads, and so forth. Let's just leave that on Mix Console for right now. And again, it's a good thing to look for the tabs because sometimes they're at the bottom of these zones. Now let's look at the right zone. So I'm going to click that right zone controller button, and it has 6 individual tabs. There's a VST Instruments tab, Media, Control Room, which is what CR stands for, the Meter, as well as the Master and the Loudness tabs. And then if you have multiple monitors on your computer, be aware that these things can be put onto a separate monitor like the mixer that I showed you already. But you can also have the VST Instruments window visible on a separate monitor as well. So if you didn't want to see the right zone on your project window, you can turn that off, but then you could go to Studio and call up the VST Instruments window, and it is a separate window that you can put on any monitor, including over the top of the main project window, except then it's going to be covering up some of the other things that you see on your project window. But that's where multiple monitors really come in handy because you can put a lot of these separate windows in these zones onto a different monitor. But for the time being, let's reveal the right zone, and I'll try and leave that on through the rest of this section so that we're really looking at these 4 individual zones. And next, let's spend a little bit more time on the left zone.